So welcome everyone. As you know from the curriculum, we're going to be learning about care maps, but we're also going to be talking more generally about care in the community. Before I get into things, let me give you just a quick background on myself. So for the past 15 years or so, I've focused on this issue of how do we people take care of ourselves, our families, our communities, and have done a lot of work in both kind of on the research side of trying to understand what do we do. But also a lot of the effort over the last many years has been in developing tools and methods so that people can look into their own lives. So tools for people rather than tools for scientists. And what you're going to be learning today is much more along the lines of the tools for people. The thing that might be relevant is my academic background seems to be far afield from what we're talking about today. So I did my undergraduate and my graduate studies in aerospace engineering at Princeton and Stanford, and then went to Columbia for business school. And so before I fell down this rabbit hole, I worked in the normal Silicon Valley industry. I was a scientist at NASA for many years. And then I worked for companies like Apple and Adobe and Motorola and so forth, doing, well, normal Silicon Valley types of things. But I fell down this rabbit hole and here I am. And you're going to be learning some of the things that I've been working on. And if it's not obvious to you, it is obvious to me that that previous work deeply influences the way I think about community and care today. So whatever you're studying today, who knows what it will lead to, and don't be surprised if you wander off into strange territories. So I'm going to start today. Let me share my slides. So I'm going to start by actually sharing with you some photos. I'm going to start with some photos by this fellow, Zun Li, who is, one of these very talented people. He's a doctor, he's an artist, he's an educator, and I'm going to show you some of the work that he has, these photos he's taken from some of his projects called Black Love Matters, Father Figure, and West Charlotte Field Notes, because I find that through his pictures, we can really see how he has been investigating life in the Black community and sort of through his photos and his deep involvement in those communities. And it helps us to see what does care look like just in normal life. Here's an example of a father and his two children. And you can just see from how they're standing and the smiles that they're deeply connected to each other. Here is goofing off in bed and brushing teeth together or just playing in the yard. Sometimes you have to fix owies and stuff, which is really critical. But there's also just mundane things like walking to school and helping comfort them when they get bored in church. Dinner time is always a big thing, and so is bath time. And this particular photograph of this father and his daughter, on the background on the wall, you see a series of paintings he's done about 365 days with dad. And so it's just lovely how Zun has captured these kind of everyday, mundane, trivial moments in life, but which show how much we people care about and for each other. And he's done that kind of at the community level as well. So, here's a photo of a bunch of people getting together for kind of a block party, and then just a family that's out and about. And hopefully, when you see these photos, it'll remind you of similar things in your own lives that show how we behave normally. As you've been learning in this class, health and well-being is not just about illness, and it's not just about dealing with healthcare professionals, doctors and nurses and so forth. As you've come to appreciate, health and well-being happens wherever we live, we work, we play. And likewise, care is not only about helping people because of their illness. Care, of course, includes what we do for our children, what we do for our elders, but it's also how much we care for and are cared by our friends. And, as you get out of college and you move into the work world, you might discover that some of your closest friends are in fact your coworkers. We also, if we start paying attention beyond our close friends and family, you'll see that people put a lot of heart and soul into caring for their customers. Teachers put a lot of heart and soul into caring for their students. And all sorts of other people in the community actively help create sort of the well-being in our communities. And it's learning to see this that I want to talk to you about. So Atlas has developed some tools that I'll be teaching you, the care map, that each of you can use to carefully observe care in your own lives. And these tools give you a new language, new methods, new ways to see the interconnectedness amongst us. But before we get into those tools, I'd like you to think about your own observations, the pandemic and all the disruption that's brought, but of course, all the social and political upheaval as well. And because of this, many of us have come to see our own families, our own communities in a new light. Anthropologist Margaret Mead has said that helping someone else through difficulty is where civilization starts. And in other words, how we all care for each other is foundational to how we build communities. Fred Rogers of Mr. Rogers fame said, you can't really love someone else if you don't love yourself first. He said that, valuing your own self-worth, your own uniqueness, but also seeing and making space for the uniqueness in others is how our neighborhoods thrive. A community is formed through collective caring and connecting. It provides people a critical sense of belonging, and it gives us a place to express our love and to receive love in return. So in short, a community gives us the freedom to imagine what is possible together. Margaret Wheatley, a writer and teacher of communities that are worthy of human habitation, said, the real engine of change is never critical mass. Dramatic and systemic change always begins with critical connections. So what we would like you to think about now is more deeply about acts of care at home, at work, in our neighborhoods. Think about care in sort of the greatest sense you can, emotional, social, environmental. So care is the heart of community. So have you seen others around you show up for care? Have you shown up for yourself? And how has your self-care impacted those around you? And so I'm going to talk to you about this care map, which is a tool. The care map ends up being a tool that's very useful for helping people pay more attention to care in their lives. It's a simple diagram of who's caring for whom. It's a snapshot of a person's care ecosystem at a point in time. There's these simple icons that represent people and pets and places, and arrows showing who is caring for whom. And we're going to talk more about this. You're going to learn how to do it. You're going to draw your own. But to highlight a couple of top level things, a care map may or may not be correct. It's never complete. It describes the perception of the person who draws it kind of at that moment in time. And as it turns out, though it looks simple, it has turned out to often have a profound impact for many people. And it's also important to appreciate that it's not the drawing itself that is most powerful, though it is useful, but it's rather the impact that comes from thinking about that you do as you draw it. Who should I include on this? Who's involved? And then later on, using the care map to spark conversations with others in your ecosystem is really where most of the magic ends up happening. So the impact that I mentioned varies a lot. And so I want to share with you three stories before I really get into more details about the care map. So one young woman in her late 20s had been suffering from long COVID for about a year when she drew her care map. And as she drew her map, she grew angry as she saw clearly and starkly how little support she had received from friends and family. Now, this happens sometimes when people draw their care map. You get stark clarity on how bad things are. She also felt frustrated remembering what life was like before she got COVID, when she took pride in being strong and independent and just capable. And this actually brought to her a new realization that her pride and independence had in fact gotten in the way of her asking for or receiving help. For her, a big aha was that, in her words, she had to put aside her ableist self-image and allow others to care. Another person was a waitress, an immigrant, and she felt very alone before she drew her care map. Except for her husband and children, all of her friends and family live far away in South America. But as she drew her map, as she found herself including many of her coworkers, she discovered that her self-image was really wrong. That over the years of being here, she had in fact grown very close to several coworkers. They were deeply involved in each other's lives. They were not just coworkers, they were family. She realized, I am not alone. This was a big change in her perspective in her life. The third person was a middle-aged man originally from Hawaii. His map included his parents, who lived about an hour away, and then lots of family back home in Hawaii. In the map, he saw how alone his parents were, compared to the family back in Hawaii, who had these really strong ties to each other, and had led him to start a conversation with his parents about possibly moving back to Hawaii. He felt that, well, if you start thinking about it now, maybe in 5-10 years, you can be prepared to move back so that as you get older, you'll have much more support around. The care map in this case sparked a conversation. It also got his father thinking, and his father eventually realized that, well, I actually have these close friends that weren't on the drawing that my son did because he doesn't know them. And so this led to a deeper conversation where, as it turns out, the father is not alone. He has close friends, whereas the mother is, in fact, kind of isolated. Other than the father and her son who visits occasionally, she's just not connected with much. And so this question about moving back to Hawaii has become much more complex now, that it would be better for the mother, but perhaps not so good for the father. It hasn't added clarity on what to do, but they're all appreciative that they as a family have a much better understanding of what the situation really is. So, for all three people, learning to see made a big difference in their lives. It was very powerful. Let me show you a little bit more about the care map. As I said, it depicts the care ecosystem, kind of who is caring for whom in the way you see your family and friends. And you think about, who all do you care for? Who else cares for them? Who cares for you? So you're really thinking of it in multiple ways. And the diagram emphasizes presence in two different ways, that the people who are involved more frequently get big fat arrows, where the people who are connecting infrequently get dotted lines, but also in the sense of space. So the people who live nearby or in your own home are near you in the diagram, where the people who live far away, often Hawaii or wherever, are at the edges of the paper. And the diagram also essentially gets you to think about, what do you count as care? Because there's effectively no rules on what is care from your perspective. You will use your own thinking to decide what goes on the diagram. So let me walk you through a few examples. So here's a simple one. Faye and Josephine are a family that lives in Oakland. Faye, at the time of drawing her care map, she was around age 30. She had to take a leave of absence from graduate school to be able to take care of her mother, Josephine, who has dementia. And it's gotten to the point where someone needs to be there 24/7. And so as you can see from the big fat arrow, Faye is doing a lot to care for Josephine every day. There's also 4 doctors involved in Josephine's care, and Aunt Joan, who lives in Stockton, comes by every 3 months or so to basically give Faye a break for a weekend. You'll see that Faye's drawn a simple arrow back from Josephine to herself to acknowledge that her mom is still her mom and still does what she can to care for her. Just because she has dementia doesn't mean she lacks all agency. Her mom is still involved. And likewise, there's a few other people that Faye included in the diagram that care for her. There's a couple of family members, a couple of friends, a therapist, and so forth. And so at a glance, you can see that there are several people involved in this family's care ecosystem, but it's also quite clear that almost all the burden is on Faye. This example is a family in Sacramento. Hannah and Gaston share their home with 5 pets and Hannah's brother, Harvey. Harvey has a whole slew of health issues that require a lot of support. So you can see the big fat arrows from Hannah and Gaston and a daycare center. But you also see that there's a church in the picture, which at the time was sending a DVD of their services to Harvey every week. He could no longer go to church, but it was such an important part of his life that the church was doing this, and it provided Harvey an enormous amount of emotional support and kept his sense of being connected to his community. So that was why he included that. And then Harvey's brother at the top of the diagram is kind of never there, but he sends money, and that makes a big difference for the family. Likewise, Gaston actually has a big fat arrow back to himself because he has a slew of health issues and he does a lot every day to care for himself, and he wanted to acknowledge that. But you can see that there's just a lot of arrows going to each other. Gaston's also caring for his mother and his wife are very connected. And this shows kind of the reality of our lives, that almost every single person is actively and simultaneously caring for themselves, caring for others, and being cared for. We have this habit of using terminology like caregivers and care recipients and so forth, which are useful in context, but remember that we as human beings are all of the above almost all the time. So these care maps are not just for older people caring for sick people. This was a care map by a woman just recently out of college living in New York. Her family was back here in the Bay Area. So you can see they're off on the left. One of her brothers is still at home. Her parents are there. And she and her mom talk a lot, many times a day. And so that's why there's a big arrow going back and forth. She's also included her brother's girlfriends with big fat arrows both ways to acknowledge that, well, the primary people in their brother's lives are their girlfriends. She's also included some of her friends, both in New York City, as well as her friends back in California. One interesting thing to point out is she included an aunt in Florida who she doesn't actually interact with a lot, but the aunt is helping her pay off her college loans. And that's a huge relief to her. And then secondly is this friend M. M lives literally in the apartment building next door to her. And she says that she and M rarely talk. They're not friends in the sense that they hang out a lot together, but they are friends. And both of them find enormous comfort in knowing that in case of emergency, there's someone who is right there. And so that's why M stands out amongst her friends. Finally, this is a care map by Sammy, who's at the time of drawing was 8 years old. He lives in San Jose. I'll tell you a little story about this. So his mother had participated in a workshop where she learned the care map from me, and she found it really powerful. And so she decided to teach her son how to do it. And she had sat with him very patiently to have him draw his care map. She told me about this several months later, and I was like, oh, that sounds so cool. Can I see it? And she couldn't find it. So she sat down with her son and said, Mr. Mehta wants to see your map. I'll help you draw it again. And his response to his mom was, Mom, I don't need your help. I'll just go do it. So apparently it's very easy to do. Anyway, so this is what he drew. I redrew it to take out some very personal information and to make it neat. But basically, he shows himself doing a lot to care for his grandfather every day. He acknowledges that his grandmother does a lot as well, but he's, core to the situation. He says his grandmother is tall and skinny. His grandfather is short and fat, which is why he's drawn him this way. He acknowledges that his mom does a lot to care for himself. And he's included a few other people. There's a couple of friends, Marco, his dad, his school, a friend far away in New York. But he's also drawn his cat, and the cat's in a cloud because the cat has passed away. But Sammy feels that his cat is still very much watching over him. And so that's why he included it. You should know that the second time he drew his care map, he didn't include his cat. And so his mom asked about it, and he said that Mr. Mehta would not understand. She made him put it back in because she said I would understand. Anyway, just so you know, I know a whole lot of second graders, so 8-year-olds, who have drawn their care maps because this amazing second grade teacher in LA decided to teach all of her kids how to do it through COVID. And with the point being that you can do this too. After that, I'll spend a little bit of time kind of giving you some examples of how people have personalized their care map. One of the huge benefits of it being hand-drawn is that you can draw whatever you want. And some people have gotten quite creative. And then after that, I'll give you a little bit of kind of background on how this tool came about, the impact that it's had out there already, and other tools that are also available. And I'll close with this idea of personal science, of having this disciplined approach to analyzing your own life. And so give you some examples of that. So that's what we're going to do. Okay, and so I just want to give you some ideas about personalizing your map, such as including Spotify. And the first set that I'm going to give you are ones that we actually learned from other people the first time. You've seen them since then, but we first learned from other people. So one of the first places we started doing care map workshops was in Santa Barbara. And it was great that people started putting in, their local beach or their favorite trail, their yoga class and so forth, because they felt those things were so important to their sense of well-being. And so, yes, of course, feel free to sort of think about things and include them as is appropriate for you. The other thing is, when we were first doing care maps, people often use these bidirectional arrows just to acknowledge that it's bidirectional. But then over time, we started encouraging people that just to see the reality that sometimes things are bidirectional, but not necessarily equal. And so, like in the case of Faye and Josephine, Faye had a big fat arrow going to Josephine and a small arrow back. And so you might often find yourself drawing better if you use two separate arrows. Another thing that was really eye-opening for people was to sometimes go even further than the instructions. And so I'll talk about this one example. There was a woman who included the fact that she was caring for her elderly mother who lived on her own in her own community, and how there were several neighbors who also helped out her mother. But she started thinking about, well, how does my mom see things? And she realized that her mom, in fact, sees herself as kind of the mother hen of the people that she knows. She's kind of the oldest woman in her circle, in her neighborhood. So she sees herself as the person to watch out for her neighbors, even though the daughter's perception was quite different. But kind of getting a sense of her mother's perception really helped the daughter understand why she could never convince her mom to come and move in with her, because her mom would feel like she's abandoning the people that she's taking care of. So if you take your care map further and start thinking about how do other people view the same situation, you might see things differently. Oftentimes there are people that are doing a lot to care for themselves. And as in one of the examples I gave with Gaston, had a big, fat, heavy arrow to himself. So do that, if that's your situation. For example, there are children with type 1 diabetes or other such illnesses and so forth, and they do a lot to take care of themselves. And it's really good to recognize that reality. You saw from Sammy's care map that he had included his ex-cat. But in fact, the first time we saw such ghost people was in one of our workshops, when one woman commented that she had an aunt who had passed on, but had been a huge influence on the family. And that even today, no major family conversation could pass without someone saying, Aunt would have said this. And never mind that she's no longer there, her vote still counted. And so you might have such people in your family who still have huge influence, even though they are no longer alive. Another one was just, someone said, well, there's this person who is always involved, but is such a negative influence in this thing. But they wanted to include them on the care map, but not portray them as sort of positively contributing. And the simple solution to that was basically scribbling over the arrow. And it was just an indication, an extra symbol to include such things. And so lastly, carrying this idea further, I want to show you an example that kind of adds a lot of information to the care map beyond what the normal things, normal kind of instructions imply. So in this example, which is somewhat made up from kind of a larger thing that I simplified, was this person put these window panes around the people and colored in the box at the top and the bottom to indicate other characteristics of the relationship. She ended up using the top box to indicate her relationship, the quality of her relationship to that person. So she has really close relationship with her best friend Anne, friendly with her mom, kind of no relationship with Dr. Fred. She used the bottom part of the rectangle to color in to acknowledge how long has she known this person for. So she's known her friend Anne for less than 5 years, her mom all her life, etc. And then she also used this kind of legend she came up with some symbols to indicate the type of care being provided. So she and her friend, are social friends. They and help each other with various household things. She helps her mom with everything and so forth. You don't have to follow this, but the point being, feel free to add to your care map in ways that work for you. If part of the idea here is to remember that this is a tool for you, and so you can make it work for you however you want. If you end up learning more of the Mapping Ourselves tools, which I'll talk about in a moment, you'll end up having a much richer kind of visual vocabulary to take advantage of such things. So let me move on from there. Think about all the different ways that you have either provided care or received care. And so what are those things at a very, very, very tactical level, like sharing music playlists with friends. In our experience, that is the norm, that our care professionals, they don't kind of exist in our day-to-day lives. And so they think they're really key, but we don't. And for what it's worth, when I've had care professionals drawn their own care maps, so doctors, nurses, social workers, they don't include them either. So this is kind of just the norm about things, that we don't see them as integral to our lives. And that's sometimes even true for people that are really, really sick, where you would think that their doctor is really key. So it's quite common, not surprising. But I also thought it was interesting. Someone talked about the idea of looking at the reality of what is today and then consciously thinking about, should I change? Should I put more effort over here? Should I put less effort over here? And it's a natural part of sort of discovering what is and then asking yourself, is that the way you want it to be or not? It was also interesting, I think, the impact of COVID, in a sense, reflecting today, how has my life changed over the last 15 years, that this is today's care map, but it's different than what it might have been 2 years ago. And I think you can do the same thing in thinking forward. You might imagine, what will my life be 2 years from now, 5 years from now? And part of it is simply thinking about, what would I like it to be like? So that's really key. One of the learning things for me over the years has to discover how involved, how critical to families the older teenagers and the young 20-year-olds are to their families' well-being. They really are heavily kind of leading. Many people seeing that their care map is small, and this idea of quality versus quantity. There is that reality that our care maps can vary dramatically. Some of us are in a very tight community, others are social butterflies, seem to be connected to everybody. And given our different personalities and contexts, there's not such an ideal care map. It's what is it for you. But one of the things to think about, and perhaps this will be part of your class elsewhere, is this whole idea of the power of the strength of weak ties. The idea that if you have a small group of, let's say, 5 people that are really close to each other, they're wonderfully supportive of each other, and they're the only people you talk to, in a sense, you know everything that your group knows, so you don't learn more by talking to them. Whereas if you have certain connections that are in different parts of the community, that in a sense you have access to much more knowledge, much more networks than just your strong ties. So the weak ties that you might have in your life end up having great value as well. It's just something to think about. I thought it would be worthwhile for you to hear how did the care map come about and evolve. So I'll give you a brief history of Atlas, and might give you an appreciation for how does like ethnography show up in the real world? How does learning happen? So to start the story someplace, in 2014, I had organized a roundtable along with one of Jan's colleagues at the Institute for the Future. And we gathered about 20 experts on care from around the country. We met at the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto and really talked about what could be done to improve the situation for family care. And this was a report that we published, and the report cover with the iceberg was emphasizing one really important point that we wanted to make, which was essentially that families do a lot more to care for people than professionals do. Now, you should know that this is a really bad, unscientific drawing of an iceberg. If you drew a real iceberg, the tip would be much smaller and the bottom would be much bigger, giving you a closer representation of the truth. As it turns out, an iceberg is a lousy metaphor because the difference is far more extreme. So the second diagram, it gets closer to the truth. This was data from the VA, at least back in 2014. At the time, the average VA patient got 1 to 2 hours of professional care a year, which meant the other 8,765 hours of the year, these people were caring for themselves or being cared for by family. So the difference isn't 10%, 90%, it's 0.02%, 99.98%. This is closer to the reality. We people care for ourselves. That's why there's very few professionals on your care map. Kind of recognizing this reality also led us to conclude, how can we capture more real data about care? Kind of one of the key things we acknowledged in that roundtable was how little data there exists. Yes, we've got great anthropological studies and their surveys, but in this modern big data world, data about what do we actually do day to day in our homes, hour to hour, to take care of ourselves is essentially a data-free zone. And so we came up with a large research study in which we took advantage of all sorts of new sensors like Fitbits and so forth, and cutting edge ethnography techniques to study families deeply. And we published a report on kind of methods to study families in much more depth. One of the things we did, collecting new data, we had to come up with new ways of diagramming it. And so the care map that was on the cover was an example of this. And one of the most unexpected findings was how much the families that participated in the research enjoyed or appreciated learning about themselves. Now, this was a surprise because going into it, we assumed people knew about their own lives, but it turned out by seeing such diagrams, they learned so much that even when they discovered things that were sort of sad to learn, they discovered in more stark clarity how hard their lives were. They still appreciated the knowing. And so this led us to continue our work by switching our focus from developing scientific methods to developing tools for people. How can we create tools that help people explore their own lives? And so one of the first steps was going away from kind of this Adobe Illustrator version of a care map to a hand-drawn approach for care maps. So we simplified the process, came up with a way to teach it, and then over these 2 years, ended up teaching care map workshops, hundreds of people in California, across the country, even abroad, to see the impact that that had. Kind of sparked the kind of thing that you're learning now. I want to tell you about these people as part of that. These are a group of volunteers in an organization in Santa Barbara called Promotores de Salud. And they're essentially community members who, in the Spanish-speaking community, who try to learn about health topics and bring that information to their own community. They're kind of liaisons, if you will. And so with that kind of mindset, they had attended a care map workshop with the idea of thinking, well, if this is useful, we'll bring it to our community. But the workshop of course, did that, but it ended up having a much deeper impact. They happened to be people too. And so, of course, when they drew their care map, they learned a lot about their lives. In fact, it was quite the cathartic experience for many of these. There was crying in the workshop and so forth, and a lot of support from each other. And that ended up having a huge impact in some of their lives. Some of them talked about this being life-changing. And we have to tell you that our initial impression was essentially, what in the world are you talking about? How could this possibly be life-changing? So we spent a lot of time with the group to kind of understand what was going on. And some of it was having an appreciation. Where am I putting in energy? Where am I receiving? Should I make changes to that? So they took sort of more control of their lives. One of the key things was, in our society, we have this self-impression, women as superheroes, that they're supposed to be able to hold down a job, take care of the parents, take care of the kids, all without complaining. And of course, this is absurd. It is overwhelming. And seeing this kind of more starkly allowed these people to be more conscious about that, to both ask for and be willing to receive help from others. And in certain cases, discovering that their family members would not reciprocate, in which case it led to some hard decisions about, well, okay, then I'm not helping either. Not easy decisions, but they learned a lot about the process. Most importantly, from, in a sense, my learning, was discovering how this process of thinking together dramatically changed their relationships with each other. They became much more human with each other. They became closer with each other. And they also discovered kind of the value of their collective knowledge. So each of them were struggling with different things. And by being open about their struggles, by their solutions and so forth, they learned a lot from each other. And as things have worked out, these women are now the go-to people in Santa Barbara County for teaching others about care maps and using care maps and so forth, much more so than the nurses and social workers and other professionals who have also learned these tools. They come to it with this much more human approach than kind of the professional hands-off approach, and it's made them so much more impactful. They've gone out to teach everybody. So we learned a lot from them and these workshops. And so in 2019, we took stock of things to try to understand what in the world has happened. How do we build on this? How do we do more about this? And it led us to develop a larger collection of tools for self-reflection and a much richer program for both teaching people and really knitting communities together, which we called Mapping Ourselves. At the tool level, presumably all of you had to download this PDF, Mapping Ourselves, because you used it to create your care map. And no doubt you've seen that there's several other tools in the book. And this is, if you read the thing, you've already learned this, but let me just briefly tell you about these 6 tools. So the social network is a way of highlighting different characteristics of the people that you're connected to, which ends up being a better starting point when you're analyzing not so much your family, but your coworkers or your soccer team or your book club or whatever. The two together end up being really powerful. The conversations tool is really to help you kind of understand the impact of conversations in our lives. Many scientists talk about, that we almost live through our conversations. It's almost like, if you didn't say it to someone, it didn't happen. By design, to have a starting point, the conversation tool ends up focusing on live conversations. So in the sense, face-to-face, video, telephone. But as you do it, you'll start to have some sense of how is that similar or different than kind of your asynchronous conversations, your texts and so forth. Also, from the design aspect, one of the things that really jumps out is the use of yellow and blue. And yellow are the conversations that left you energized. Blue are the ones that left you drained. And as you do this, you'll really discover how much of an impact conversations have on your life. The daily activities tool is very much inspired by one of Jan's books on busyness. In the book, I'm quoting, it says, "Busyness reveals issues that reach to the heart of who we are and what we wish to become." And so we created this tool to help you really take stock of, where does the time go? We purposely made it not look like a calendar to kind of break that mindset. It can be quite powerful. The environment tool is a moment of mindfulness about the space that you're in. What's the quality of light and the messiness and the sound and so forth, and how conducive is it to you? How's it impacting you, your mood, your ability to focus, and so forth. And it's really about learning to be aware. If there's no such thing as the right environment. For example, if you're having a romantic meal with your romantic other, you probably don't want bright lights and so forth. You probably want dim lighting. And on the other hand, if you're out there dancing, if that's allowed in this post-COVID world, you probably don't want the music to be soft. So is this environment appropriate for what you're trying to do? And we also designed this thing. I know it looks weird, ancient hieroglyphics or something, but it's designed to be doodleable. So you can take a moment of meditation about your space anytime you want. This last tool, body connection, we start off with just giving you sort of 6 physical, mental things to pay attention to over time. It's very easy to add different things, and it just gets you to appreciate how you change over the course of a day. And sometimes you can learn a lot from these. Just to say a couple of words more about these tools, they are unfamiliar. It takes some time to learn. There's no getting around that. On the other hand, once you learn them, you discover in retrospect that they're really simple. So you're getting accustomed to a new visual language, but it's not that hard. They are all, just like the care map, designed to be flexible. We encourage you to change these things to suit your needs. And as that kind of more extravagant care map modification example that I gave, you start stealing from the different tools and mashing visual language to whatever works for you, which in the end makes these tools really, really powerful. In 2020, what we did was we ran a bunch of mapping ourselves workshops across Michigan. We had high school students in a rural community go through these workshops. We had social activists in Detroit, part of it. We had restaurant workers in Ann Arbor. We had corporate executives. We had government executives, all kinds of different people, partly to test, are people? And the answer is yes. Everybody has care issues. Everybody has families. Every single group found it worthwhile to do this. And every single group, the collective connections, the social bonds became much, much stronger. And so that's what we're building on now. And very briefly for this year, we've been using that in 2 particular places. We've been working with this community of people that have an illness called long COVID. And so we're working with a community organization there to really help them improve their ability to take care of themselves. And then we've been working with basically organizations who care about employee well-being and want to build a culture of belonging, especially with so many people working from home and the stresses of the last couple of years. There is a sense of social isolation, of atomization that's occurring, and people want to feel togetherness, and going through this process together helps. So that's what we're focusing on. And then lastly, what I wanted to tell you about is the larger idea behind these things. And so these tools and stuff haven't been created kind of in splendid isolation. In fact, a ton of people have contributed to these ideas over the last 10, 15 years. One of them is this community, very loose-knit global community of people who explore ways to study their own lives and see what they might learn from it and develop tools and techniques for this. So I've been part of this since our very first meeting in 2008. Some of Jan's colleagues have been very involved with this from the beginning as well. And this group of kind of global innovators is really leading the way. And I'll give you some examples of quantified self-talks, but people explore all sorts of things in their lives. From one of the most fascinating was excuses for not exercising. And the girl who did that ended up learning a lot, which basically boiled down that she'd been exercising too much. There's a lovely talk about grasses and sneezing, which, as odd as it sounds, has eventually led to really new methods for helping soldiers with PTSD. And so some of the little experiments end up having huge implications. There was a talk that you can watch about a guy who wanted to test How well could he run? Could he run better if he didn't eat during the race? And to appreciate this, the race was 78 miles over 24 hours without taking any food. You can learn a lot. You probably don't want to replicate their experiments, but most of us can learn a lot from them and their methods, which we certainly have. The other place that I wanted to recognize was a designer named Georgia Lupi. She's with a design firm called Pentagram. In her day job, she advises Google and IBM and Microsoft and the World Bank and all sorts of big name people on information design and information graphics and analysis. But in her personal life, she's done amazing work. This book, Dear Data, was a collaboration with a friend of hers, Stephanie, another designer. And every week for a year, the two of them decided to pay attention to something in their lives. So the clothes they wore, the complaints they made, or the sense of aloneness, where they ate, and so forth. And each week they forced themselves to come up with a new way of presenting that information in a useful way. It's a amazing body of work, which is now part of a permanent collection at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It's really amazing. And then they also wrote this other book, Observe, Collect, Draw, to teach you how to do it. So I'll stop there on the slides and really say that the practice of personal science is simply the idea that you, in your own life, can use a disciplined approach to study anything in your life that is important to you. You can find a way to observe carefully, to gather data, to analyze, to visualize, and talk to others about it, and can be very powerful.